Okay, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks very much for joining this webinar on how to construct and write your literature review. My name's Phil Gooch and I'm the founder of Scholarcy. I'm also previously a researcher in a number of fields, including occupational therapy, mental health, natural language processing, and health information systems. Today, we're going to take a hands-on approach to the processes involved in creating a robust and repeatable literature review. It's going to be show as much as tell, and will involve some live demonstrations where we will create the outline of a literature review in real time. And we'll use a number of great tools to help in this process. First of all, I'll say a little bit about Editage, who are sponsoring this webinar. And thank you very much, Neha at Editage, for setting this up. Editage provides a wide range of services for authors, including language editing, translation, preparation, and workshops and webinars, video summaries, infographics, and much more. So let's begin. So what is a literature review? Well, before we say that, what is the process that we're going to cover today? So we're going to look at different types of literature review. We're going to look at what makes a good review and what distinguishes a good from a less good review. And we're going to look at the process of searching, screening, and writing up. And this isn't a linear process. This is an iterative process where you do a little bit of searching, a little bit of screening, a little bit of writing, and then you repeat the process. And the output of your screening will help feed back into your next search in terms of adding new keywords, new key terms to help improve your search process. Now, before we continue, I'd like to find out a bit about the people in this webinar. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen. And there is a poll that we've added here. Just be good to find out from you what your backgrounds are with its humanities, computer science. Oh, I can see lots coming in already. That's fantastic. Thank you. So we have a lot of humanities, which is great. I used to work in digital humanities at King's College, and yeah, it was had a great time there. As a research developer, building software to support the humanities researchers. So we've got kind of a strong showing from life sciences as well, which is great. We'll be looking at life science literature reviews, and then computer science, engineering, and physical sciences. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much for doing that. I will try to tweak this presentation to reflect the makeup of the audience that we have today. And feel free to add any chat. We'll be doing questions at the end. So everything that you put in the chat, Neha will gather and add to the questions, and then we'll cover those at the end. Okie doke. I'm going to share my screen again. And we shall continue. So a literature review is a critical evaluation of the current state of knowledge in a chosen academic subject. The word critical is important here. It involves comparing, contrasting, and considering the strengths and limitations of each work, finding gaps and unanswered questions. And this is in contrast to something called a literature report, which is just an uncritical summary of findings. A literature report is basically an annotated bibliography, but it can form the basis of your review, as we'll see later on. And when we say current state of knowledge, what we need to recognize is that we will only ever review a sample of the literature, and how we take that sample will depend on the type and depth of the review that we want to do. So let's have a look at different types of literature reviews. At the highest level, the review that is most rigorous and has the least bias is the systematic review. And the systematic review aims to answer a very specific, focused research question. For example, do educational and behavioral interventions reduce the risk of stroke in the over 65s? And systematic reviews tend to be done by a team of researchers rather than just one person. And they carry out an iterative process of searching, screening, and filtering, and they review each other's work as they do this. The goal is to reduce the risk of bias and to be as objective as possible. Multiple databases are searched to make sure that the review is as comprehensive as possible. And as well as the references at the end of each paper are also searched. And even individual journals and hard copies are hand searched as well to find every scrap of evidence to help answer this review question. and there are often strict criteria for including papers in the review. Systematic reviews can be quantitative, where the statistical results of, for example, randomized controlled trials are aggregated together so that an overall picture of the current evidence can be gleaned. Or they can be qualitative, where we're going to do something like a thematic analysis, look at common threads and common themes that run through the literature, and can these be grouped in some way? And the example I'm going to show you a bit later is an example of a qualitative metasynthesis. Narrative reviews sit somewhere in the middle. They're not as rigorous as a systematic review. They may be slightly more biased. And this is your typical standalone review that you will write for your thesis or dissertation. And you want this to be a standalone piece of work that is still comprehensive and unbiased, but you may be more, you may cast the net a bit wider in terms of the type of papers that you include. You may include non-peer-reviewed work, so you might discuss preprints or white papers or what we call grey literature that might be government reports. So you might have a wider inclusion criteria, but you still want to be thorough in terms of your analysis of each paper. And then at the bottom is the weakest type of review, which is the related work section of a paper that is a wider piece of research. Related work sections tend to be biased because, and it's human nature to do this, they tend to be there to show the researcher's own work in a good light. For example, you may see statements in papers that say, we're the first to tackle this problem, or we're the first to use this method, or others have tackled this problem, but our results are better than theirs. And all this might be true, but the purpose of the related work is to show your research in a good light. Whereas if we want a standalone literature review, we want to avoid that bias and be more objective as possible. So as we said, a good literature review has less bias, and we reduce the risk of bias by making it comprehensive, so we search a wide range of literature. We're objective, so we avoid our own inbuilt biases or own needs and put the need of the reader and the researcher above our own needs of trying to show our own research. We want something that's repeatable and documented. If you have a repeatable search strategy, then in future someone else can rerun your search and get a different set of results, but they can follow your methodology and build on top of your review, which is good because they'll also cite your review. So you get a citation out of it too. So you really want to follow these sort of checklists to make sure your literature review meets these criteria. And as I said earlier, a good standalone literature review is a publication in its own right. A number of journals have a review section and you can submit to there. If your review is rigorous and good enough and covers a wide range of sources, then you have the potential of publishing it. I had the good fortune of publishing 2 reviews when I was a student. The first when I was doing a diploma in occupational therapy, and the second when I was a first-year PhD student. And these were both published in good journals. And I was able to achieve this by following these guidelines and making sure it was comprehensive, repeatable, and documented. So what strategies do we use to find papers to include in our review? Well, I would say they fall into 2 main categories, what I call bottom up and top down. Bottom up is where we do some initial exploration, where we start with a few papers that perhaps have been given to us by our supervisor or that we found through a general search. And then from these seed papers, we look for other papers that are related to it, maybe that cite these papers or are cited by them. And there's a bunch of tools that we're going to use to help us with this bottom-up part of finding papers for our review. And then alongside that is top-down, where we start with, instead of starting with papers, we start with keywords and we search for papers. And these 2 strategies go hand in hand because we may extract key terms from these seed papers, and when we find new papers, we may feed them back and get their references and find who cited them. So these 2 processes go together. And there's a number of tools that help with the top-down approach, as we shall see. And in terms of screening then, this is a useful checklist that you can use when you're screening each of the papers to include in your literature review. Does the paper clearly state its goals? And do they describe their study subjects or data sets? not all papers will have human participants. Some of them will be modeling papers or theoretical papers where they'll be working with a data set or somebody else's data. Are these adequately described? Could you do this yourself? Could you repeat this if you had the data? And the methods, again, are these repeatable methods? Is there enough information to reproduce what the author is describing? Or is this described in a supplement somewhere if it's not in the main paper? And this is quite important, the discussion of prior work, because it's obviously you want the results to be presented in a clear way, but do they relate back to what's gone before? Is there that comparing and contrasting going on that you can see that the authors have considered the previous work that's been done and they're building on that or considering it in some way? And again, this is very important. Every study should acknowledge its limitation. All work, even the best research, has limitations, and it's important that studies acknowledge this. And finally, do the conclusions follow from the results? So once the results have been discussed, there's usually one or two key takeaways. Do these follow on from the results that have been presented? Okay, so if we do all this, then you should have a good chance of having a good review. So let's try to do this in real time. So I'm going to take a bit of a risk here and do a bit of a live demo where we're going to analyze some seed papers. We're going to get related papers. We're going to build a search strategy. We're going to run it, and we're going to analyze the results. So let's do that. I'm going to switch to my browser, and I hope you can all see this. So my subject area in my PhD was in clinical guidelines. So clinical guidelines look like this. This involves evidence-based best practice for providing treatment recommendations for a specific clinical condition. So this is an example of a clinical guideline for treating acute heart failure. And these guidelines exist in PDF form like this with bullet points and telling you things that you have to do. But perhaps more usefully for doctors and nurses, they exist in this flowchart form where you have a series of steps with the evidence and the information on the right and the flowchart on the left. And what I was trying to do in my research was see, can we use natural language processing to automatically turn this into this? And then can this, if this information is in a computerized format, can this be connected to the patient record to automatically monitor whether the best treatment is being recommended to the patient? And it turns out lots of other people were trying to do the same thing. And so let's look at a piece of work on this. So imagine I'm doing a literature review on these clinical guidelines and how these can be turned into clinical workflows that somebody could actually run as a doctor as part of something called a decision support system. So I have this seed paper that I found that was published a few years ago, but there was one of the more recent papers on this topic since I published my own paper on this. So what we're going to do is do a quick analysis of this using a tool called the Scholarcy Chrome extension. And what this tool does is with the PDF or article in your browser, it's going to distill this down into something we call a summary flashcard. And what it does is try to pull out the key information from the paper and present it into a format that's easy for us to navigate and easier than squinting at the PDF on the screen. So what this has done here is given us a number of sections. And the first bit we're going to look at is the comparative analysis section. So this is a machine-generated section from the paper, so that Scholarcy's AI has generated this for us. And what it's done is showing us where the paper has done some comparative analysis. So this is one of our checklists for our reviews. This is part of our quality criteria. Does the paper contain a comparative analysis? And our AI says, yes, it does. It can look at differences with previous work. And it gives us some references that we can click on. So the first thing we want to check is if this is a good paper to include in our review is, do they cite other work and do they compare and contrast? And it looks like they do. And we can actually go to this paper and get a quick summary of the findings. So what it's going to go away and do is try to chase that chain of references and find reference number 17 and summarize it for us to check that whether the paper is being adequately represented in this critical analysis. And a quick scan of this suggests it is, that they're talking about workflow modeling and clinical guidelines and looking at workflow patterns. So that's great. So this is already passing some of our tests because it's looking at comparing and contrasting and looking at how it builds on or confirms previous findings, and also differences with other work as well. So that's great. The other thing this paper does, according to our summary flashcard, is consider its own limitations, which is great. We have a little section here, and we can see that this study was done by computer scientists and not by clinicians. So, you know, they were using their technical expertise to model these clinical situations, but they didn't verify it with actual doctors. So that is a limitation of the paper. So the other thing we can do is use this tool called cite.ai, which you may have come across, which tells us if other people have cited this work and how they have cited it. So I'm going to click on this here and see that 3 people have also cited this work. And these are potential new papers that we could include our review. This is talking about business process models and something called process mining, which we may not be familiar with. So we can have a look at these papers as well if we like. But we're starting to get a picture that other people are citing this work and they're looking at the same sort of thing: workflow patterns, process mining, clinical guidelines. So what we're going to do now is save this paper to our library. Oops, I've been signed out. Let me just sign in. Right. Let's do that again. So I'm just going to save this paper to my library, and here it is there in my Scholarcy library. We'll say a little bit about Scholarcy in a second. I'm just going to go back to the papers. Okay, so we've got one paper here that we're going to include in our review. Now the next thing is to find related papers, and there's this really good tool called connectedpapers.com that does this for you. So I've just put in a DOI, and what it's going to do, just like that, is build a graph of showing me all the papers that related to my seed paper, which is great. And it's relating them by the citation network. So it looks at papers that they cite in common. And what I'm interested in is in papers that are more recent than 2016. I'm going to look at what they call derivative works, which are papers that have been built on or have been influenced by that paper. And we can see we've got one at the top here that was published a couple of years after that's got 9 citations. And it's a review paper, which is great because review papers are really helpful for our own literature review, particularly if we're writing a review in 2021. We want to see, well, the last time someone reviewed this stuff was back in 2018. So I want to see what's changed since then. So I'm going to have a look at this paper, and it exists on Semantic Scholar, which is another great resource for your literature review because it gives us more recommended papers and topics to explore. And again, I'm going to use the Scholarcy Chrome extension to analyze this paper, and here it is here. So it's given us some more keywords that we can add: decision support systems. We've got clinical guidelines, we've got patient-centered care, we've got things like adverse drug reactions and so on. So this is looking at a new angle on clinical guidelines, because normally a clinical guideline is just looking at a single patient and a single condition. But this is looking at this thing called multimorbidity, where a patient may have more than one thing wrong with them. They may have heart failure and diabetes or some other condition. And again, this paper has a comparative analysis, which is great. So that's a check mark here. Yes, quality criteria. It's comparing itself with previous research, and it's showing how it's building on previous research, which is great. And again, we can analyze a paper that it cites. And this paper talks about, again, chronic patients, patients with comorbidity. So these are all key terms that we can add to our search strategy. So we're already building up a search strategy that has things like clinical guidelines, workflow, process modeling, that didn't work. Electronic health records. So we've got clinical decision support and so on. And finally, this review paper talks about future work, which is what we're going to use to help with our literature review. This shows current gaps in the knowledge. So for example, it's saying that future research needs to look at applying more than one guideline to a patient and looking at adverse interactions and making it more patient specific. So this all looks good. So we're going to save this to our library as well. Okay, there it is there. So that was the bottom-up approach to gathering papers, and now we're going to look at the top-down approach, which involves doing a search. Now, I've got a search already prepared to save time, but you can see these are key terms that I got from some of these papers. So this paper had key terms like computer interpretable guidelines and so on, and workflow. So I put this into this tool called 2dsearch.com. And what 2D search does is allow me to search multiple databases at the same time, which is fantastic. So I can create one search strategy in a visual way. So I just type them in here and put them into blocks, and then I can run this on any database I want. And this search strategy contains 2 blocks. So it's got stuff on clinical pathways and a section on health records. And what this means is that it's saying, I'm going to find anything that has any of these topics and any of these topics, but I need at least one from here and one from here. So let's run this against PubMed. As we have a lot of life science researchers in the audience, I'm sure you're very familiar with PubMed. So I've run this on PubMed, and I want to filter this since 2016 because my seed paper started then, so I want anything after that. And I'm going to select some of these papers to save to my library. So these all look interesting. It's all about modeling clinical guidelines again, and this looks good. Process modeling. This all looks like useful stuff. We've got a few more here, and so on. So I'm going to save these papers to my computer. So in PubMed, I do save to Citation Manager, and I'm going to save that file and put it in a little folder that I've created here. So these are my search results, and it's just created a little BibTeX file. Now, what I'm going to do is import these search results into Scholarcy library. So what Scholarcy is, for those of you who don't know, it's like a reference manager, but what it does is rather than storing the paper, it stores a summary of the paper with the key information. So there's a link back to the original paper, but what it stores is what we call a summary flashcard. And what I'm going to do here is upload my BibTeX file that I exported from PubMed, and it's going to magically turn this into summary flashcards for us that give us the key point of each paper, the key finding. Now, this is going to take a couple of minutes, so I'm going to switch over to one I prepared earlier, if that's okay with you, just to save a bit of time. So while that's churning away there, and we can wait for that to finish, but while that's churning away, here are the same papers that I imported earlier on. So what it's done is it's given me like a headline finding of each paper, like a one-line summary, and tells me how many people have cited it and so on. And what we can do then is go into each record and have a look at the information in it. So one useful thing, again, one of our screening strategy checklist items was, do they talk about the study subjects? So let's have a look. This study involved 3 clinicians, 2 internists and 1 pediatric oncologist. And what it looks like is this was a modeling paper. So they didn't actually run this with real patients. What they did do is, let's have a look at the highlights that Scholarcy has extracted for us. They basically created a proposal to take clinical guidelines to handle 2 types of patient preferences when these patients have multiple clinical conditions. So what they've done is create this model in combination with these clinicians to make the clinical guideline more personalized to the patient. So this looks useful. Did we get any other papers that are like that? Well, this also looks like personalized pathways again. So let's have a look at this one. What did they do? Well, again, Scholarcy highlights the study subjects for us, which is handy. Actually, this is more promising. This has looked at real patients, 48,000 patient records they did. They actually modeled 48,000 patient records. And they used a different approach where they were mining the healthcare record to try to infer some kind of clinical pathway from them. So we're seeing that a narrative starting to build up, that we're seeing people doing research on modeling personalized treatment pathways, either directly from the healthcare record or doing it ahead of time by doing a sort of a modeling exercise with clinicians, as we saw in this paper here. And we can go through each of these papers and view their key information. So let's look at this one, for example. We can jump straight to study subjects, and this one looked at 356 patients. So we can start to compare and contrast all these different modeling papers. What did they actually evaluate it on? How many patient records did they actually test this out on? So the next thing we can do is generate a bibliography from this. So I'm just going to export these to a bibliography file. And I'm going to go to my reference manager to have a look at that. I'm using Zotero here, but any reference manager will do. And I'm going to import this file that I've exported from Scholarcy to generate my bibliography. And there it is there. So you're probably thinking, well, why is he doing this? Why not just import these PubMed records directly into Zotero? Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Why would we do that? Well, there's two reasons for doing that. One is that Scholarcy gives you all that data analysis and breaks down the paper into its key findings for you. But the other thing is that information then is exported directly into Zotero. So as well as generating a bibliography, which I can right-click and do here, I'm just going to create a little file here. And then I'm going to open that up. Word. And there's my bibliography, so I can start to use that and reference from that. But the other thing is that we've got all that summary information here. So all that information from the Scholarcy flashcard is now preserved as notes, and we can edit this. So we can type in our own notes here and so on, and export this directly from Zotero into our own note-taking software, whether we're using something like Microsoft Word or Notion or some other thing like Evernote or whatever. The other thing you can do then is select all your papers, right-click on them, and generate a report from all these notes that you have in there. And you get the article and the abstract, and then you get the summary information from Scholarcy or that you've edited. And again, this can be the basis of your literature report, which has the uncritical summary of the information in each paper, which you can then annotate, and then you're going to turn this into a critical analysis. So that's one example of how we can start the process of a literature review using bottom-up and top-down processes, ending with a annotated bibliography. The other thing I was going to show you is something else we can do, which works more on the systematic review side, where we've got quantitative information rather than qualitative. So I've just collected a set of papers here on a cancer drug, a fairly recent cancer drug called pembrolizumab, and I've got a number of papers here, and I'm going to export them to Excel for analysis. So one of the things Scholarcy does is all the summary information that it automatically extracts, it stores in this flashcard that you can see here, but it allows us to export this to Excel for analysis so we can see them side by side. So let's do that now. So I'm going to export these 23 papers to Microsoft Excel, and it's going to download my Excel file, which is great. And I'm going to open that up in Excel now, and here it is. So you can see all that summary information that Scholarcy extracted is now in a spreadsheet for us, which is great because we can now see how the studies compare. This one had 119 patients, whereas this one had 1,034. This one had 16, and this one had 17, but different conditions. This had 655, and so on. So although they're looking at different cohorts of paper, they were all looking at the effectiveness of this drug on reducing mortality. And again, we can see which papers consider limitations. So we can see that this one is honest and says, look, we only had a small number of patients here. And sure enough, 119, yeah, it wasn't a huge number. And similarly for this cohort where they looked at 52 Japanese patients, we saw again that they acknowledged that the sample size was small. And then we can analyze the findings. So we can see that the rates here were, let's look at the endpoint here. There's the confidence intervals and so on, and the response rate, and the overall survival was higher in the treatment group than it was in the other group. So again, we can start to compare results and start to do that compare and contrast and analysis, and potentially export this information into another package to do our statistical analysis of the results. Okay, so that's just a very quick whiz through the process of using a number of tools: Connected Papers, Scholarcy, 2D Search, PubMed, Cite.ai, to help with curating our list of papers and then doing some initial analysis of them. So how about writing up then? So we've done the analysis, we've got the papers, we've done this iterative process of building our search. What's the best practices for writing up? Well, I thought I would do this by looking at one of my own, I hope you don't mind, one of my own literature reviews that I published back when I was a first year PhD student, and how I tackled this problem. So I had a whole bunch of papers, I had about 100 papers, and I was thinking, well, how do I start writing this up? Well, I didn't start with the introduction. So although the introduction is first, it's not the bit I would write first. In fact, I would write the introduction last. So the reason for doing that is that sometimes you don't know what you're going to write until you've actually done the research, and you don't know what the introduction is going to be and how you're going to set the scene until you've already done quite a bit of research already. So you'd leave that bit to the end, once you've got a clear picture in your head about what the narrative is that you want to convey. You want to, identify who are the key players and who are the seminal papers, and as if you're setting the scene for a novel or a play or something. What the key things that we're going to talk about here. And then what is your problem statement? So if I go back to the introduction here, I ended it by saying my problem statement here, my objectives were to identify the themes and the practical challenges of implementing process-oriented systems in terms of clinical guidelines, and summarize them and how they're integrated with clinical workflow, and then develop some kind of model. So that was my aim. And then the next bit I did was the searching and screening bit. And again, you need to document how you do this. And the easiest way to do that is to draw a diagram. So you remember our search strategy that we had in 2D search? Well, we can write this up into a diagram here that says, okay, these are our search terms. And then we got 16 papers, and then I added these, and I got another 1,300 papers. And then I screened the abstracts, and then I excluded things like book chapters or opinion pieces or editorials and so on. And I eventually ended up with 108 papers that I reviewed. This is a very nice way of summarizing your methodology. And again, it's repeatable because someone else can come along 5 years later, run the same thing, and they say, well, actually, I got 2,000 papers now, or I got 50 papers or whatever. And then they can compare and contrast their results with your results. And then you do your analysis. We looked at how we do the initial analysis. We touched on that briefly by exporting the data to Excel, and we looked at the individual summary flashcards that we could annotate and add notes to, and so on. And then we look at the discussions. So discussion normally comes towards the end, and this is where you provide a synthesis of all the information, and you look at the pros and cons of each part, and you kind of end it by looking at things like limitations and so on. And so it's important, this is very important, make sure you have this section in your discussion, review limitation. So, we only did English papers between these time periods, and there was things we missed out. And then finally our conclusion. How do we wrap up? So how I concluded this literature review is just recapped what we were aiming to do, which surveyed the literature and identify themes. And we built a thematic model, and we clustered these themes. So this is just like a 2-sentence summary of the rest of the paper, basically. And then this is our takeaways. You always want to end with like a key takeaway. What did we really find? We found that the literature was evolving along this process where we were moving from individual clinical guidelines, as we saw at the beginning, towards ones that are more adaptive and more responsive to patient needs. And in this case, I concluded that these were being run on the web, which I don't think is so true now, but at the time people were experimenting with semantic web, and so that's what I wrote. And they were using workflow management systems. And the key finding as well, that great, it's all very well to model this stuff, but we need to actually do this in the real world and actually evaluate it. And it still seems that people are still modeling and they're not evaluating enough. And maybe we saw that when we touched on our literature review gathering process earlier. So that's kind of how you would structure a review. And that's certainly how I did it, and it sort of worked for me a couple of times now in terms of getting a review as a standalone chapter in my thesis, but also something that I could publish. So I hope this has been helpful. I'd like to have plenty of time for question and answers. So, or if there's anything else you would like me to clarify. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing now and start taking questions. So I'm just going to flip back. Okay. I can see, thanks Neha for curating the questions. I have one at the top from JP. Is the analysis and other summaries extractive or abstractive? Thanks, JP. That's a great question. So the tool that I showed you is mostly extractive. And I think you want it to be extractive when you're doing literature review because you want to know what the author actually said and then decide for yourself how much you trust that and do the comparison and contrasting. We do have a separate tool for doing abstractive summarization, but that has a different purpose really outside this. So yeah, at the moment it is purely extractive, and it's really the purpose of doing that is to show you, what were the key findings of the paper, who were the study subjects, what were the limitations, what future work did the author describe needed to be done, and so on. So that was the goal of doing it that way. How do we know if scholarly is absolute relevant? I think, thank you, from Queen K. So I think by that question you mean, how do we know if it's pulled out the most relevant information? Yeah, that's a good question. And, certainly there's other tools that are out there as part of this process that we looked at, not just Scholarcy. The idea of Scholarcy is to give you a quick overview of the paper so you can see some key information. So in terms of relevancy, it will certainly pull out things like study subjects, study limitations, future work, introduction, methods, results, conclusions. The actual summary and the key highlights is, yes, potentially it might not always pull out the most relevant information, but some of the more objective information, like the existence of specific sections in the paper, or whether there's a comparative analysis, for example, that will be there. The highlights and summary is somewhat of a subjective process, and people will have different needs about what they see as relevant. Some of us are looking for different things when we talk about relevance. Scholarcy is open source or paid tool. So Scholarcy isn't open source, but we do have free tools. So the Chrome extension that I showed is free. And we have another tool on our website called Flashcard Generator, and that's free to use as well. It's only the web library that allows you to curate your papers and save them is a paid tool. So what else have we got? What is the function of Scholarcy? I hope I covered that in what I was doing, because I was summarizing papers with Scholarcy and using the Scholarcy Chrome extension to do that, Moses. So thank you. I mean, if you like, I can do a quick recap of what Scholarcy does, if that's helpful, as we've got a bit of time. So let's just switch back to that window. So this is what Scholarcy does. It curates our papers and it summarizes them into these flashcards. So I can jump straight to the study subjects, study limitations, future work, study registration. So for example, if this study was already registered, I can go and see that on clinicaltrials.gov. So it generates all these links for us. But in terms of the free tools, you have a paper in your browser, you click the Scholarcy Chrome extension, and it's going to go and distill it for us and pull out the key facts and findings for us. And so that's basically what Scholarcy does in a nutshell. It distills the article down into this flashcard format where you've got the abstract, you've got the key concepts. If we don't know what some of these are, we can click on them and it goes to a definition of those. It does the comparative analysis and so on. So that's what it does. It basically breaks down the information for you. Okie doke. Let's have a look. Is it useful for social science, from Anandi? Thank you, Anandi. That's a really good question. Am I still sharing my screen? No, I'm not. That's good. Great. So Yes, I think it is useful for social science, but it depends on the paper. It works best on papers that are quite well structured. So if you have social science papers that are more narrative and are more discursive and are more philosophical, it may not work so well on that. But give it a try. As I say, we have a number of free tools on the website that you can try out. So do try out our free tools that are linked to on the website and see what you think. Anna says, is there a criteria to choose the seed paper? That's a good question. So I just found my seed paper through a Google search on clinical guidelines and looked at ones that were quite recent, and I did computer interpretable guidelines. So you could get a seed paper from your supervisor or through a recommendation from another student, say, hey, you must read this paper, or it could be a paper that's highly cited or recent. It's more about how you screen that paper. So what I showed earlier was taking a seed paper and screening it for quality by looking at, does it contain limitations? Does it have a comparative analysis? Does it contain future work? Does it cite other sources? Does it have related work and so on? So those are all these things that will all feed into that mix. Juan Carlos says, could you please put again the last tool, TD search? Yes, I would be happy to do that. I did skip through that a bit, didn't I? So Juan Carlos, I'm just going to share my screen again, and let's just check that that's all there. Right. So I hope I'm sharing that screen now. You can see app.2D search. If you go to the website 2dsearch.com, 2D search is free to use, and you just log in, I think, with your Google account or an email address and start creating a search strategy. I think it comes with some built-in ones for you to try out. So it's got one on telemedicine, and you can run these. And that's a whole different subject. There's lots of documentation on the 2D search website about how to use it, but it's a really nice visual tool for building your search strategies up. And you might say, well, I'm going to disable this particular concept, so I'm going to hide these, for example. You can do all that. 2D search is probably a scope, has its own. It's probably value in having a completely separate webinar just on 2D search, and I can ask the developer of that. Maybe he might be interested in doing that in future for you. So yeah, it's a great little tool. So Annalise asked, can you use Scholarcy to import citations in a Word document? Yes, you can. Yes, Scholarcy will extract the citations at the back of the article, as well as PDFs. So yes, it can do that. It can extract those. If you've got an existing Word document that has references at the end, Scholarcy will extract those. Can Scholarcy collaborate with Zotero to import? From Lisa. No, not directly. So you can export from Scholarcy into Zotero, as we saw, but you can't directly use Scholarcy inside Zotero, if that makes sense. We can export a bibliography from Zotero and import that into Scholarcy, and Scholarcy will turn those bibliography items into summary flashcards. But the two don't work directly together. So yeah, I think I demonstrated the import process from Scholarcy into Zotero, but we can go the other way around as well. Suniti Vaishya, I hope I pronounced your answer correct, your name correctly there. So apologies if I didn't. Is Scholarcy works with paper from every field of science, which might have a different structure? Yeah, that's true. So it will work with papers that have a sort of introduction, methods, results, conclusion. But if they don't, you will still get the highlights and the summary and the references at the back. So, for some articles, they don't have that structure, but you'll still get the back of article references that you can click on. You'll still get the summary and the highlights. Amina says, what website am I working with? Yes, it's called scholarcy.com. So I'll just put that in there, but it's also on the web page for this talk. Scholarcy.com is what I was using there. to do the analysis of the papers. Other questions? We've got lots of questions. Copy of the presentation. I think this video is being recorded, so you'll have it there. Scholarcy has a free Chrome extension and a free flashcard generator for us to use. You don't download it, you run it in your web browser. That's from Mark's Perfecto. Asa Yazid asked about, is the website called To Do Search? It's called 2D Search, 2dsearch.com. This will all be in the slides in the video. I think if we make the slides available, then you'll see that link in there. So thanks for that question. It's called 2dsearch.com. I just put that in the chat. Other questions here. How many literatures should be screened before starting writing? Erman, that's like $1 million question. I don't have the answer to that, but certainly don't wait till you've screened 100. I mean, maybe start doing some initial analysis after you've got maybe 10 or 20 papers. There's not a definitive answer to that question, I'm afraid. Kezar asks, how should we craft introduction and literature review in PhD thesis? What are the differences between these two chapters? That's a very good question, Kezar. So the introduction is really going to talk about what your PhD thesis covers as a whole. So, you know, what problem are you tackling? What is the makeup of your thesis? So you're going to introduce, say, you know, my thesis contains 9 chapters. The first one is the review. Then I go on to looking at problem statement, and I look at how I did the modeling, and then I did my, you know, so it kind of, the introduction, you write that last anyway. You don't write it first. You save the introduction to the very end after you've actually written everything else in your thesis. And the literature review, as I mentioned earlier, is a standalone piece of work. It can exist outside your thesis. It has its own introduction and its own methods and its own results, and it can be published separately. Tanvi asked, how would this process differ for qualitative research? Well, the literature review process should be the same in that you're going to find papers, you're going to study them and analyze them and pull out key facts and findings and summarize them and compare and contrast. So the process should be the same, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. JP about extractive, I think I answered that one earlier. How do you outline literature for narrative or relative work? From Adnan, I'm not sure about that. I might have to come back to that one. How do we synthesize the literature for scale development? That's very specific. Wouldn't be able to answer that one, I'm afraid. Farial. Scholarly open source, I think I've answered that one. Non-native English speaker, it's really hard to write a paper in the beginning. Yeah, writing papers are hard. I think the best way to learn to write a paper is to read lots of papers. And again, if you can break them down into chunks using something like Scholarly, that will help you to read a paper and help you to learn how to construct those sentences that are used. Because a lot of academic writing uses certain norms and certain expectations about how you describe things. There's a sort of certain style that you can learn over time. How to avoid plagiarism in literature review, that's very important. So first of all, you always got to cite your sources. If you're going to quote directly from a source, then you make sure you put it in quotes. You say this is a direct quotation, but you really need to figure out how to paraphrase, and how you don't just copy and paste from a paper. You're going to have to figure out how to restate those ideas, and you do that by reading lots of papers and synthesizing them together. So you start looking for common themes, common ideas, and you can say, well, you know, these 5 authors all talked about this, but these other authors talked about slightly different interpretation. So it's through that process of comparing and contrasting and citing correctly that you avoid plagiarism. So Nalman Wazir asked, can you summarize the tools? I mean, the software. So we used 2dsearch.com, we used scholarcy.com, we used connectedpapers.com. These will all be in the slides as well, which should be made available. Can we follow the same steps for literature review for PhD dissertation? From Huma Rao. This is really just about literature review rather than the whole dissertation. Niraj, how many papers linked with this tool? I'm not sure I understand that question, I'm sorry. Should we report only the last 10 years for a review? Potentially, from Rasha asked this question, it depends. If other people have already well reviewed the literature before that, then you could start where they left off. So if there's already a really good review article that already goes up to 2012, then you don't necessarily need to repeat that. You might say, well, look, these guys already covered everything up till 2015 or 2018. So I'm going to start from there and say what has happened since that time. So there is no definite cutoff. If you want to do a really wide-ranging review that covers everything, then you can go back as far as you want. But it depends how much time you have, really. Online instrument to gauge English language. I'm sorry, no, that's out of scope, and I can't answer that one from Randolph. Does Scholarcy integrate with all types of reference managers from Adnan? Scholarcy can import and export any reference manager that supports RIS or BibTeX format, which is most of them. So yes, pretty much all the reference managers, including Mendeley, Zotero, EndNote. Can the tool be used for qualitative and quantitative? I think it can. I mean, I was just focusing on literature reviews here, but yeah, I mean, the best thing is to try it out because it's free to try out on our website and see what you think if it works well for qualitative as well as quantitative. I would say it works less well for philosophy, but better for maybe sort of social science and things like environment and geography and so on like that. Gosh, there's lots of questions still to get through. I may not be able to cover all these. An integrative review from Deborah. Yes, it is type of systematic review because you want to integrate the findings and come up with themes, overarching themes. There is a paper that I mentioned in the slides. It's let me just see if I can find it for you, Deborah, just a second, that goes through all the different types of literature review. Let me just see if I can find that. It's from Grant from 2009. I'm just going to put this in the chat window. So, right, have a look at this paper from Grant that I put here in the chat. On typology of reviews. I'm afraid there's so many questions, I'm not going to be able to get through all of these. Let's just try to answer a few more. Thank you so much for your questions and for your consideration. It's great to see such an attentive audience with all your questions. I'd love to do a follow-up on this to answer more of your questions. What tool did I use for multiple search at the same time? That was 2dsearch.com. So what else have we got here? Can we import to Mendeley? Yes, you can. You can export a BibTeX, or I'm sorry, a RIS file from Scholarcy, and you can import that into Mendeley. Can we give feedback? Yeah, we have a little feedback widget from Tausif there. Thanks, Tausif. Yeah, you can use the feedback widget, but not on specific sections, just on the general general thing. You can talk about the section, but we don't have a section-specific feedback. I can't recommend a basic reference manager, I'm afraid, Sinead. There's lots of them. How can we generate the BibTeX file of papers run on Scholarcy? Well, Scholarcy export is a RIS file, which is like a BibTeX file. So it doesn't export BibTeX at the moment. It exports a RIS file of all those papers. But most reference managers will work with RIS. Where can we get the free Chrome extension from your website? If you go to, I'm going to put the link in here for you all, so you can try it out. Thank you for that question, Anna. Bear with me a second. It is linked on our website, but I'm going to give you the direct link here. So here's Anna's answer here. There's a link to the Chrome extension. That's not a very friendly link, is it? Let's do a better link. Faisal asks, if the recording be shared? Editage will be sharing the recording on their website. Okay, let's try to cover a few more. We've got 5 minutes left. Could you please share how to analyze the papers in an Excel spreadsheet from Amal? Well, I only had time to touch on that briefly, but you get the sections of the summary card in there. So you get the key findings, you get the limitations, you get the study subjects. You've then really got to do your own work in analyzing that data and deciding how you're going to compare different study groups together. So there's no kind of like magic bullet to that work. It's really what the Excel spreadsheet gives you is just a starting point for that analysis. Haslina asked, how do we know that we've already searched enough paper in our literature search? That's a good question. So one thing you can do is start looking at the references in each of the articles that you've included and follow those and see if you can include those in your review. And eventually you'll run out of papers to find. You have to acknowledge that you won't find every paper. And that's a limitation. You could say, look, I only searched between 2015 and 2020. I may have missed some papers. But you want to, you're probably going to be screening maybe several hundred or maybe 1,000 papers and reducing it down to a set of 100. But not necessarily. There may not be that many papers in your subject area. There may be fewer. Diana Kasserman says, is using paraphrasing tools allowed? I would say no. Don't do that. Try to write things in your own words. Use tools to help you understand the information, but don't use them to paraphrase. No, I would say don't do that. And I mean, use it to help understand, but don't take the information directly from there. Does it work with management articles from Fariel? I don't know, but you'll have to try it and let us know. Try it on the Chrome extension or the flashcard generator on our website. Please share the website for the flashcard generator from Mahesh. I'll be happy to do that. It is linked on our website, but I will just put it into the chat window now. So where are we? Here you go, Mahesh. I've just put the link in the chat there. But if you go to scholarcy.com, you'll find a link to it. Thank you for your lovely questions. And yeah, I hope to catch up with you again soon. I think we're almost out of time. Do I have time for any more questions? Anyone got any final questions? Someone asked about summary from a plot. I think summarizing graphs. No, I don't know any tools that can summarize a plot. That would be nice, wouldn't it? The thing is to remember about all these tools is they're there to help you. They're not meant to replace doing the work. They're there to sort of give you a head start, to help you understand a new subject, or just help you filter through the noise, really. That's the purpose of these tools, is to help you focus on what's important. And then once you've done that, then you can start to figure out how you combine this information into your own piece of work. Great. Okay. What else have we got? What is the precision? Does it capture specific scientific context clearly from papers? From Suniti Vaishya. We've got a link on our blog where we did an analysis of how well it captured the information, Suniti. If you go to our blog on our website, you'll find discussion of that there. How does Scholarcy pull information? Is it automated or curated? It is automated. I'm not sitting there curating it. It just the AI extracts the information for you. So it's not always 100% accurate, but we're improving it all the time. And yeah, we welcome your feedback. Thank you very much. Okie doke. Thanks for joining. Neha, would you like to say a few words to finish up before we close? If not, I will just thank you all for joining this webinar. It's great to see you all here, and thank you so much for your questions. You can contact us on Facebook or Twitter. If you've got any further questions, we'll be happy to answer them for you. Other than that, I will end this session, I think. As I said, the video will be available on the Editage website soon, so you'll be able to download that, and you'll see all the links in there of all the tools that I demonstrated today. Okie doke. Thank you so much.